The day everything began to unravel felt like any other, until it didn't. I had just returned home from work, ready for a quiet evening with Emily. But when I stepped through the door, the house was unusually still. She wasn't there, which struck me as odd because she hadn't mentioned going out that day. Usually, her schedule was packed with business trips and meetings, but I always knew ahead of time when she'd be away. I checked my phone, no messages. Something felt off, but I brushed it aside for the moment. Later that evening, I received an unexpected call from my father. We didn't talk often, and when we did, it was usually about family matters or small updates on his health. This time, though, the conversation took a different turn. "I've been thinking about the future, son," he began, his voice steady but serious. "The estate, the money, it's all going to you. It's only right." The words didn't quite register at first. My father had been a successful businessman, and though I knew he was wealthy, I'd never considered the details of what he would leave behind. The estate alone was worth millions, and then there were the investments, the properties. My mind started to spin. "Dad, I don't need," I started, but he cut me off. "Don't argue with me. It's what I want. I've been talking it over with Emily too. She's been very helpful." That last sentence struck me like a hammer. Emily? Why was my father discussing his estate with her? She had never shown much interest in my family's wealth before. I had always admired her for that. She wasn't with me for the money. Or at least, that's what I had believed. The conversation ended on a somewhat unsettling note, with my father reminding me that everything would be handled soon. I hung up the phone, a strange feeling gnawing at my gut. Something was wrong. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the unease. Emily had been increasingly distant over the past few months, but I had chalked it up to stress from her job. Now, little things were starting to pile up: her frequent absences, the vague answers about her business trips, the way she'd been glued to her phone recently, always hiding the screen when I walked by. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something more going on, and I was determined to find out what it was. One evening, while Emily was supposedly away on another one of her trips, I got a call from an old friend who worked in the same industry. He had seen Emily at an upscale resort, far from any business meeting location. She wasn't alone. The person with her wasn't a colleague or a client. It was my father. I felt my stomach drop. My father? No, that couldn't be right. There had to be some mistake. But as I pressed for details, it became clear this wasn't just a one-time encounter. My wife and my father had been spotted together multiple times over the past few months, always at luxury resorts, always under the pretense of business. The realization hit me like a freight train. Emily had been cheating on me with my own father. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? Why? The questions flooded my mind, but none of them brought comfort. I thought about confronting Emily immediately, but I knew I needed more than just an accusation. I needed proof. Over the next few days, I began piecing things together. I scoured through old messages and receipts. Emily's recent credit card statements were full of charges for lavish hotels and restaurants, all in places she claimed were for work. But her work didn't send her to resorts and tropical destinations. She had been lying to me for months, and I had been too blind to see it. And then there was my father. My respect for him had been absolute, unwavering, until now. I couldn't understand how he could do something like this, betraying not just my mother but me, his own son. He had always been so proud, so loyal, but now I realized it had all been an illusion. He wasn't the man I thought he was. I decided to confront Emily when she returned from her latest trip, but I needed to be prepared. I wasn't just going to accuse her without evidence. I needed to catch her in the act, to lay everything out in front of her, and watch as she tried to explain her way out of it. I wasn't looking for an explanation, though. There was nothing she could say to make this better. The worst part was knowing that she had manipulated my father, likely for the money and the house. The inheritance was a substantial fortune, and now I began to understand why she had been so keen on getting close to him. It was never about love, it was about power, control, and securing her future. That night, I made the decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let Emily get away with this. She had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. But first, I needed to wait for the right moment to expose the truth. After discovering the unsettling truth about Emily and my father, my world felt like it was crashing down. I spent nights pacing our living room, the silence of the house weighing heavy on me. Every time I thought about confronting Emily, I felt a deep pit in my stomach. I wasn't ready to deal with it head-on yet, not until I had solid proof, but the pieces were already starting to fall into place. The next few days were strange. Emily came back from her business trip, acting as though nothing was out of the ordinary. She greeted me with her usual smile, a kiss on the cheek, and even asked how my week had gone. Watching her move around the house, so calm and collected, made me realize just how good she was at lying. It sickened me. "Any big meetings while you were away?" I asked one evening as we sat down to dinner. I could barely choke down the food in front of me, but I kept my face neutral. "Just the usual," she replied, not even glancing up from her plate. "You know how it is, all work, no play." I almost laughed at the irony. All work, no play? She had been at a luxury resort, enjoying expensive dinners and trips to the spa, none of it for business. I knew this now. She was lying through her teeth, and it was taking every ounce of self-control I had to keep from calling her out on it right then and there. Instead, I kept up the charade, pretending like everything was fine. But my suspicions continued to grow, and I started paying attention to every little detail. She was more secretive with her phone, always keeping it locked and turning the screen away from me when a message came through. I caught her texting late at night, claiming it was just work-related, but I knew better. The lies were piling up, and the weight of them was suffocating. One night, after she had gone to bed, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I waited until I was sure she was asleep before carefully slipping out of bed and heading downstairs. Her phone was charging on the kitchen counter, and this was my chance. I knew the passcode, it was the same as our anniversary, and she had never bothered to change it. My hands trembled as I unlocked the phone, unsure of what I would find but knowing I needed answers. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The messages were there, hidden in a separate folder, cleverly disguised under a generic name. But once I opened it, the truth came spilling out. Conversations between Emily and my father, secretive. They talked about their trips, about meeting up at the resorts, and even about the inheritance. Emily had manipulated him, playing the perfect daughter-in-law to secure her place in his will. The money in the house, it was all part of her plan. I scrolled through the messages, my heart pounding in my chest. There were photos, 2 pictures of them together, smiling like a couple on a romantic getaway. The sight of my father, a man I had always looked up to, with his arm around my wife, made me sick. How could they do this to me? How could they betray me like this? I put the phone back down, careful to leave no trace that I had been snooping. My mind was racing, and I felt like I was on the verge of exploding. I wanted to confront her right then, but I knew it wasn't the time. I needed to be smart about this. If I acted too soon, she might try to twist the story, and I couldn't let that happen. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. I went to work, but my mind was elsewhere. My coworkers noticed something was off, but I brushed off their concerns with a weak smile and an excuse about being tired. All I could think about was Emily and my father, their betrayal replaying over and over in my mind. When I got home that evening, Emily was sitting on the couch, her laptop open in front of her. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, but I could barely manage to smile back. Every time I looked at her, I felt the anger boiling up inside me. How could she sit there so calmly, knowing what she had done? "I was thinking," she said, breaking the silence, "maybe we should take a trip together. It's been a while since we've had time just for ourselves." The irony of her suggestion almost made me laugh. A trip? After all the secret getaways she had taken with my father? It was like she was mocking me. I forced a smile and nodded. "That sounds great," I replied, my voice tight. "We could use some time away." She seemed pleased with my response, but I could see something flicker in her eyes, something calculating, like she was already planning her next move. She was good. I had to give her that. But I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not this time. Over the next few weeks, I started putting my plan into action. I contacted a private investigator, someone I could trust to dig deeper into Emily's movements. I knew I couldn't rely solely on what I had found on her phone. I needed more concrete evidence. If I was going to confront her and my father, I needed to make sure they couldn't wriggle their way out of it. The investigator was thorough. Within days, he had tracked Emily's recent trips and found everything I needed: hotel records, photos of her and my father together, even financial statements showing how she had been using the money from our joint account to fund these vacations. The evidence was undeniable. But the real blow came when I discovered the extent of her manipulation. Emily hadn't just been planning to take the inheritance for herself, she had been slowly siphoning money from our savings, preparing for a life without me. She was going to leave, and she was going to take everything with her. I felt a cold rage settle over me as I pieced everything together. She had lied to me, cheated on me, and now she was planning to walk away with my father's fortune. But I wasn't going to let that happen. She thought she had the upper hand, but she had underestimated me. The final piece of the puzzle came when I learned that my father had no idea what Emily was really after. He had fallen for her charms, blinded by her beauty and youth, completely unaware that she was using him for his money. It was almost pathetic, watching him fall into her trap. But what hurt the most was knowing that he had betrayed my mother in the process. My mother. I hadn't told her yet. I didn't know how. The thought of breaking her heart with the truth made me feel sick, but I knew she deserved to know. She had been married to my father for over 30 years, and now he had thrown it all away for a woman, half his age, a woman who didn't even love him. I knew the time was coming. The moment of confrontation was drawing near, and I was ready for it. I had all the evidence I needed, and soon, Emily and my father would have no choice but to face the consequences of their betrayal. The more I uncovered, the more the facade of my life crumbled. Every day, Emily's lies weighed heavier on me. But the reality of her betrayal fully set in when I started to investigate her so-called business trips. They weren't what she had claimed, not by a long shot. After hiring the private investigator, I had concrete evidence in my hands. Emily wasn't attending conferences or work events. She was on luxury vacations with my father, enjoying the kind of high-end resorts I'd never even imagined visiting. These trips weren't just occasional, she had been going several times a month, all while feeding me lie after lie about work obligations. The first resort they visited was in the Caribbean. When the investigator sent me the pictures, I couldn't believe my eyes. There she was, my wife with my father on the beach. They looked like a couple on their honeymoon. It was surreal. I stared at the photos, a bitter rage building in my chest. How could my father do this to me? How could Emily betray me so brazenly? The investigator dug deeper and found that this wasn't an isolated trip. In the past year alone, they had been to at least 5 different exclusive resorts. They visited Italy's Amalfi Coast, a private villa in the Maldives, a secluded ranch in Colorado, and even a 5-star hotel in Paris. These weren't quick weekends away. These were week-long, extravagant getaways where they indulged in fine dining, private yacht trips, and spa treatments. The sheer volume of it left me speechless. It was as if they were living a secret life one I was never meant to find out about. The worst part was that these trips were funded by money from our joint account. She was using my hard-earned savings to live a double life, all while pretending that everything at home was fine. I couldn't fathom how she had managed to juggle this deception for so long without slipping up. She had always been a meticulous planner, but this went beyond anything I could have imagined. Emily was smart. She knew how to cover her tracks. She'd leave just enough of a paper trail to make her business trips look legitimate, booking flights, using corporate cards for transportation, and staying at hotels that catered to executives. But the investigator's sharp eye saw through her strategy. He found receipts for expensive dinners and private spa treatments, none of which she could possibly justify as work-related. The hotel rooms were often upgraded to suites, far beyond what her company would cover. And it wasn't just her signature on those bills. My father's name appeared on several of them too. How could I have been so blind? I had trusted her completely, believed in our life together. I worked hard to provide for us, never questioning the occasional splurge or luxury expense, thinking she deserved it. I didn't realize I was funding their secret vacations, their twisted version of romance. The photos became harder to look at as the evidence mounted. Emily and my father on a yacht, toasting with champagne under the Italian sun. Emily lounging by a private pool in the Maldives, while my father leaned back, admiring her as if she were his prized possession. They didn't even bother to hide their closeness in public. There they were, arm in arm, strolling through Paris, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. I hadn't told my mother yet. How could I? She had always spoken so highly of Emily, praising her for her intelligence and beauty. She adored Emily, saw her as the perfect daughter-in-law. The betrayal would destroy her. Worse, my father had been her rock, her partner for over 3 decades. She'd never suspect him of something like this. I was torn between my anger and the knowledge that sharing this would break my mother's heart. But she needed to know, and soon. Meanwhile, Emily continued her charade at home. Every time she smiled at me, every time she kissed me goodbye before leaving for another work trip, my skin crawled. I was counting down the days until I would confront her, waiting for the right moment. It had to be perfect, undeniable. I wanted to see her face when I laid out the evidence, when I showed her that I knew everything. I often thought about my father during these times. A part of me wanted to confront him first, to demand answers. How could he betray his own son for a woman like Emily? Was he so blinded by her looks, her charm, that he forgot about his own family? Or had he convinced himself that this was somehow justified? The question swirled in my mind, but I wasn't ready to face him yet. Not until I had all the pieces in place. It wasn't just the trips that angered me. It was what they represented. The money, the inheritance, everything was part of Emily's grand scheme. I realized now that she had been planning this from the start. She didn't just want to be with my father. She wanted to take everything from him and from me. The estate, the millions of dollars, she wanted it all for herself. She had charmed my father into thinking she cared for him, but it was all about the money. Each time I thought about confronting her, I felt the rage bubble up inside me, but I knew I had to wait. The moment had to be right. I wasn't just going to accuse her, I was going to destroy the entire fantasy she had built. She thought she could manipulate both me and my father, but she had underestimated me. Soon, she would see just how wrong she was. The night I confronted Emily was a night I'll never forget. Every second leading up to that moment felt like the calm before a storm, quiet, unnerving, with a tension so thick I could barely breathe. But once the storm hit, it was all fury and chaos. I had planned the confrontation meticulously. I wasn't just going to accuse her in a fit of rage. No, this had to be done methodically. I wanted to catch her off guard, to see the shock in her eyes when she realized I knew everything. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal. She wasn't going to wiggle her way out of this one. It was a Friday evening, and Emily had just returned from what she had called a quick work trip. I knew where she had really been, at yet another resort with my father, spending money from our joint account, no less. I could barely stand to look at her when she walked in, still radiating that fake smile, still playing the part of the loving wife. But tonight, I was done pretending. "Hey," she said cheerfully as she set her bag down by the door. "I missed you. It's been a long couple of days. We should go out for dinner, just the two of us. What do you think?" I stared at her for a moment, the words stuck in my throat. It took everything in me to stay calm. "Dinner sounds nice," I said, forcing a smile. "But first, we need to talk." Her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, brushing it off as nothing. "Sure, what's up?" I led her to the living room, my hands trembling as I reached for the folder I had hidden earlier. The folder with all the evidence, the receipts, the photos, the messages I had collected. I handed it to her without saying a word. She looked confused at first, then curious, as she opened it and began flipping through the pages. Her expression changed almost instantly. The confusion turned to shock, her eyes widening as she realized what she was looking at. I watched her closely, waiting for the moment she would understand that this was it, the game was over. "What is this?" she stammered, her voice shaky. She glanced up at me, her eyes darting back and forth between the folder and my face. "Where did you get this?" I crossed my arms, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. "You think I'm stupid, don't you? All those business trips, all the lies about work. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" She stared at me, speechless, the folder still open in her lap. The photos of her and my father were right there, staring back at her. I could see the panic in her eyes as she tried to figure out what to say. "Listen, it's not what you think," she began, but I cut her off. "Not what I think," I snapped, unable to hold back the rage any longer. "I know exactly what's been going on. Emily. You've been cheating on me with my father. You've been lying to me, using me, stealing from me. How long did you think you could keep this up?" She dropped the folder onto the coffee table, her face pale. "Please, let me explain," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "It's not just about the money. I didn't plan for this to happen, it just did." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head in disbelief. "Oh, so you just happened to fall into bed with my father? Is that your excuse?" Tears filled her eyes, but I felt nothing. I had been betrayed in the worst possible way, and there was no coming back from this. "It was a mistake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "A mistake?" I echoed. "You've been doing this for months, Emily. This wasn't a one-time thing. You've been planning this. You've been manipulating him, trying to take his inheritance for yourself." Her head snapped up, her tears momentarily forgotten. "It's not like that," she insisted. "I didn't care about the money. Don't lie to me." I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. "You knew about the inheritance. You knew he was going to leave everything to me, and you wanted a piece of it. You played him, just like you played me." She flinched at my words, her tears spilling over now. But I didn't care. I couldn't care. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, it was all too much. I had loved her, trusted her, and she had torn my life apart. "I'm done," I said, my voice cold. "I want you out of this house. You can go to him if you want, but you're not staying here." She stood up, her legs shaky as she wiped her tears away. "Please, let's talk about this," she begged. "We can work through this." "There's nothing to work through," I interrupted. "You destroyed everything." Emily stood there for a moment, her face crumbling as she realized the full weight of what she had done. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she grabbed her bag and stumbled toward the door, her sobs the only sound filling the room. As the door slammed shut behind her, I sank into the couch, the silence finally settling in. It was over. Everything was over. But there was still one more confrontation left, the one with my father. The confrontation with Emily had left me hollow, but it was far from over. I knew I had to tell my mother what had been happening behind her back. She deserved the truth, even if it would destroy her. As much as I hated the idea of causing her pain, keeping her in the dark about my father's betrayal felt even worse. That evening, I drove to my parents' house. My mind was racing with how to break the news, but nothing could have prepared me for the look on her face when I finally told her the truth. I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had countless family dinners, and gently broke the news. "Mom, I don't even know how to say this, but you need to know the truth. Dad, he's been seeing Emily behind our backs. They've been together for months. They've been on trips, pretending it's for business, but I have proof." "I'm sorry, Mom." At first, my mother stared at me, her expression unreadable. It was like the words didn't sink in at first, like her mind couldn't comprehend the betrayal. Then, her face crumbled as the realization hit her. The woman she had loved like a daughter had betrayed her, and her husband of over 30 years was the one responsible. "He's been seeing her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Your father with Emily?" I nodded, my heart breaking at the sight of her pain. She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to comfort her, but there was nothing I could say to make it better. This betrayal ran too deep. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the truth crushing us both. But then, something shifted in her. The sadness in her eyes hardened into something else, anger. The woman who had always stood by my father's side, through thick and thin, was no longer the quiet, forgiving wife I had known. She was furious, and she wasn't going to let this betrayal slide. "I won't let him get away with this," she said through gritted teeth, her voice steely. "He thinks he can throw away 30 years of marriage for some young woman? That he can destroy our family and walk away without consequences? He's wrong. He doesn't get to ruin everything we built together." I watched in awe as my mother, normally composed and gentle, stood up with a resolve I had never seen before. Her pain was still there, raw and deep, but it was fueling something stronger now: revenge. I'll call the lawyer first thing tomorrow, she said firmly. Half of that money, half of everything is mine. I helped build that fortune just as much as he did, and I'm not letting him give it all away to some woman who's using him. Her plan was already forming. My mother wasn't just going to leave him. She was going to take back what was rightfully hers. She had been a part of my father's life and business from the very beginning, standing by his side as he built his empire. She had sacrificed her own career to raise me, to support him, and now he had the audacity to throw her aside for Emily? But my mother wasn't just angry about the money. It was the betrayal, the audacity of my father thinking he could walk away from their life together, throwing it all away for a woman like Emily. My mother's hurt was deep, but she was channeling it into action. And she wasn't doing it alone. Her next move surprised me. She called my father's lawyer, our lawyer, and set up a meeting with him. The lawyer had always been loyal to our family, and my mother knew how to use that to her advantage. What she didn't tell me at first was that her plans weren't just about dividing assets. She was going to hit my father where it hurt most. The day after the meeting with the lawyer, my mother told me her next steps. With the lawyer's help, she would file for divorce and take a significant portion of my father's wealth rightfully hers. But there was another layer to her plan that I hadn't expected. I've been thinking, she said, her voice calm but laced with anger. I've wasted enough years on him, but I'm not going to walk away quietly. I'm going to make sure he regrets every second of this betrayal. I knew my mother well enough to see that she wasn't bluffing. She had a quiet strength, a determination that had carried her through life. But this was different. She was taking action not just for herself, but for the years of loyalty and trust that my father had shattered. And there was another twist. Over the years, my mother had built a close relationship with our family lawyer, Paul. She told me that they had shared more than just a professional relationship. Lately, Paul had always admired her strength, and now they had crossed a line. It was another act of betrayal this time, hers, and it was deliberate. I'm going to make sure he knows, she told me, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Paul has been there for me in ways your father never was. I've already told him everything. He's helping me with the divorce, and when it's done, I'm taking more than just half of the estate. It was shocking to hear, but I understood. My mother had spent years supporting a man who had taken her for granted, only to be betrayed by him in the worst possible way. Now, she was using every tool at her disposal to take back what she deserved. My father thought he could give everything to Emily, but my mother made sure that wasn't going to happen. By the time the dust settled, she would walk away with half of his fortune and the satisfaction of knowing that she had hit him where it hurt most. As I watched my mother execute her plan, I realized that she wasn't just taking revenge for herself. She was doing it for me too. After my mother laid out her plan to destroy everything my father had tried to give Emily, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She was taking control of the situation, making sure neither of them got away with what they had done. But for me, the rage still simmered just beneath the surface. I wasn't done either. I needed my own revenge on Emily and on my father. As much as I hated to admit it, part of me still felt humiliated. I had been made a fool by the two people closest to me. Emily had manipulated me, twisted everything we had built into a lie, and my father, someone I had admired all my life, had betrayed me for his selfish desires. They didn't deserve my forgiveness. They deserved to feel the same pain, the same sense of loss and betrayal that they had inflicted on me. While my mother went through the legal channels, I began to consider how I could take matters into my own hands. Emily was already out of the house, staying with my father, but I wasn't content with just letting her go. She needed to see that she wasn't irreplaceable. She thought she had all the power, that she could charm her way through life, but I was about to prove her wrong. A few days after Emily left, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in a while, Rachel, a stunning woman I had met through a mutual friend a few years back. She had always been someone who caught my eye, but I never acted on it. I was married to Emily then, and I had been faithful. But things were different now. I was no longer tied to that loyalty, not after what Emily had done. I wasn't looking for love or commitment. I wanted revenge. Rachel was everything Emily used to be: beautiful, confident, and full of life. We met for drinks one evening, and it didn't take long before we were laughing, reminiscing about old times, and, for a moment, I almost forgot the bitterness that had been consuming me. But then, as the night went on, I felt a twisted satisfaction creeping in. I wasn't just enjoying Rachel's company, I was using this as a way to show Emily that she was nothing special. I could have anyone I wanted, someone even more beautiful, more vibrant than her. Rachel didn't know the full extent of what had happened between Emily and me, and she didn't need to. To her, I was a man looking to move on from a broken marriage. But to me, this was more than just moving on, it was about proving a point. I wanted Emily to know that I didn't need her, that she could be replaced. I made sure Emily found out about Rachel. It wasn't hard. The town wasn't that big, and people talk. I knew word would get back to her eventually, and when it did, I wanted her to feel the sting of knowing that I wasn't sitting around mourning the loss of our marriage. I wasn't the broken man she might have expected me to be. The first time Emily reached out after leaving, her message was cold and formal. She wanted to discuss the division of our remaining assets, our car, some joint accounts, and a few smaller things. But what struck me was the subtle hint of jealousy in her tone when she brought up Rachel. "So, I hear you've been seeing someone," Emily wrote, as if it didn't matter, as if she didn't care. But I knew better. There was a bitterness behind the words, and it gave me a twisted sense of triumph. "Yes," I replied simply. I didn't offer any explanation. I didn't owe her one. The silence that followed was enough to confirm what I had suspected. Emily was rattled. She had expected me to be devastated, to crumble under the weight of her betrayal. But instead, I had moved on, or at least, I made it look like I had. In truth, I was still angry, still hurting. But Rachel was a welcome distraction, and the fact that it bothered Emily was just the icing on the cake. But my revenge wasn't just about replacing Emily. It was about taking back control of my life. I had spent too long feeling powerless, trapped in a web of lies and deceit. Now, I was breaking free, and as much as I hated what had happened, it had forced me to see things clearly. I deserved better. I deserved a life without betrayal, without manipulation. And if that meant leaving Emily in the dust, then so be it. I knew my father was aware of my relationship with Rachel too. The old man, always concerned about appearances, must have been fuming when he heard about it. It was another blow to his fragile ego, another reminder that he didn't have the hold over me that he thought he did. I could feel his disapproval even without speaking to him, but it didn't matter anymore. He was no longer the man I looked up to. He had forfeited that role when he decided to betray his own son for a woman half his age. In the end, my revenge wasn't about making Emily or my father suffer. That was just a side effect. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my pride. It was about showing them both that I was stronger than they ever gave me credit for. They thought they could destroy me, but they were wrong. Rachel and I eventually parted ways. She was never meant to be a permanent fixture in my life, but she served her purpose. She helped me see that I could move on, that I wasn't bound to the past. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all, not letting their betrayal define me. As I closed that chapter of my life, I realized that I had come out the other side stronger, more resilient. I had lost so much, but I had also gained a newfound sense of freedom. The dust had begun to settle, but the storm wasn't over. My mother's legal battle with my father had dragged on for weeks, and she was relentless in her pursuit of justice. With the help of our family lawyer, she had secured half of the fortune my father had promised to Emily. But I knew my father and Emily wouldn't go down without a fight. Their greed wouldn't allow it. One evening, my mother called me over to her house. She had a look on her face that I hadn't seen in years, calm, yet determined, like someone about to make a move that would change the game entirely. "It's done," she said, her voice steady as she handed me a thick envelope. Inside were the final legal papers, everything officially signed and sealed. My father had lost. He had been forced to give up half of his estate, leaving him with far less than he had ever expected. Emily wouldn't get the grand inheritance she had schemed for. It was over. But my mother wasn't finished. "You know what the worst part is, don't you?" she said, her tone filled with quiet rage. "It wasn't just the money. It was the betrayal, the disrespect. After all these years, he thought he could discard me like I was nothing, like all those years together meant nothing." I nodded, understanding her pain all too well. She wasn't just fighting for her share of the fortune, she was fighting for her dignity, for the life she had built with my father, only to have it destroyed by his selfishness. I want to make sure he never forgets what he did, she continued. That's why I'm not just walking away with half. I've taken something more valuable than money. I raised an eyebrow, confused. What do you mean? She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The house, she said simply. Our house. The one Emily had her sights on. The one your father promised her as part of his grand inheritance plan. It's mine now, and I made sure it will never belong to either of them. I was stunned. The house had been a point of contention during the divorce proceedings. My father had fought hard to keep it, even after losing half of the estate. Emily had likely dreamed of moving in, living out her fantasy of being the lady of the manor. But my mother had outmaneuvered them both. She had taken the one thing they wanted most and claimed it for herself. And the best part, my mother said, smiling for the first time in weeks, I'm selling it, not to keep the money, but to make sure neither of them ever steps foot in it again. Let them rot in their luxury resorts. They'll never have what they wanted most. Her plan was brilliant, and I couldn't help but admire her strength. She had been through so much, but she had come out on top. My father had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated me. And now, both he and Emily were left with nothing but the remnants of their broken plans. As the sale of the house went through, I could feel the final blow landing. My father, once so proud and invincible, had been brought to his knees. He had given up everything for Emily, and in the end, she had gained nothing. Their relationship, once so secretive and exciting, had turned into something hollow and bitter. The allure of the stolen romance had faded, leaving only the harsh reality of their choices. But there was one last thing I needed to do. I had avoided confronting my father directly throughout this whole ordeal. Part of me didn't want to face him, didn't want to see the man who had once been my hero now reduced to someone I no longer respected. But I knew I couldn't move on until I had my own closure. So, I arranged to meet him. When I arrived at the small cafe where we'd agreed to meet, he was already there, sitting at a corner table. He looked older, worn down by the weight of everything that had happened. I sat down across from him, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. I suppose you've come to gloat, he said, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't slept in days. I shook my head. No, I'm not here to gloat, Dad. I'm here because I need to say something. He looked up, his eyes filled with regret. For a moment, I saw the man I had once admired, the father who had taught me so much. But then the memory of his betrayal crashed over me, and any sympathy I might have felt vanished. You destroyed this family, I said quietly, my voice calm but firm. You threw everything away for a woman who only cared about your money. You betrayed Mom. You betrayed me. And for what? What do you have left now? He didn't respond, just stared down at his coffee. The weight of his decisions hung over him like a dark cloud, and I could see the shame in his eyes. I loved Emily, he said after a long pause. I thought she loved me too. I laughed bitterly. She loved your money, Dad. That's all it ever was. And now that it's gone, what do you think will happen? He didn't answer, and I didn't need him to. We both knew the truth. Emily had used him, just as she had used me. And now, with the inheritance stripped away, their relationship would crumble like everything else. I'm done, I said, standing up. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. I hope it was worth it. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. The final blow had been delivered not by me, but by the choices my father and Emily had made. They had destroyed themselves, and there was no satisfaction greater than knowing that I had come out of it stronger, while they were left with nothing. The chapter had closed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free.